Hey, good morning, good afternoon possibly, or good evening, YouTube. I'm assuming if you're here, it's because you want to learn about the political or economic spectrum, and we will move to that here in a little bit. But what we're going to do first is look at the first two spectrums on our screen here, and then we will eventually in another video move down and talk about the economic and political spectrum. Okay. Let's talk about our first two spectrums. So first of all, guys, just a little bit of history. The idea of leftist or rightist politics began during the French Revolution, right? During the French Revolution, it was this period of, economic turmoil, political turmoil, and people who sat to the left of the king wanted the king gone, right? And those individuals eventually become known as liberals or radicals. And you can see those two terms right here. So the liberals and radicals who sat to the left of the king wanted to radically change or dramatically change, alter the political situation in France so that individuals could have opportunity, they would have more rights, and they wouldn't be led by a king with absolute power. Now, the people who sat to the right of the king, they wanted to keep the king in power, and as a result, that's where we get the idea of conservatism. So typically, those individuals that sat to the right of the king were individuals in the first and second estate, right? Those were the individuals who were part of the church, who were part of the aristocracy, and they did not want to see things change in France because they lived lives of privilege and power. And why would they want to see things change? So this whole idea of liberal or conservative was born from there. Liberals wanting change because they see things as not great, and conservatives wanting to keep things the same because typically they have some skin in the game, right? They don't want to change the way things are. Now, with that being said, right, understanding that history, that this left versus right in politics emerged from the French Revolution, what we need to do first, guys, is talk about the most basic ideological understanding here in Social 30, and that is collectivism versus individualism. So collectivism is an ideology found on the left. And when we talk about collectivism, guys, it's an ideology that believes that the group is more important than or greater than, hence the mathematical notation there. It is more important than or greater than the individual. And in collectivist societies, guys, you always put the needs of the group ahead of the needs of individuals. So examples of collectives that we've seen or that you may be aware of would be like sports teams, right? They're collectives. They're a group of individuals. Political parties are collectives. Church groups, classrooms, right? Like kids in a class, right? Like my class of Social 30 students, that is a collective of individuals, right? Your friends are collectives of individuals. And this collective, right, to be a part of that collective, you have to sort of abide by the norms, the rules, the expectations of that group. Now, historically speaking, when we talk about collectivism today, there's a number of societies that fall under the guise of collectivism. And typically when we think collectivism, guys, it's synonymous with the idea of socialism, right? Socialism and collectivism can be seen as basically being synonymous with each other. And examples of socialist societies that have existed or continue to exist would be like the Soviet Union, right? The former USSR. That is a great example of a collectivist society where the good of the nation, the group, was more important than the will of one individual. Another example would be like modern day North Korea, right? North Korea is a collectivist society where everything you do is to further the interest or goals of that country if you're a citizen of North Korea. Cuba is another great example of it, right? Cuba currently is a communist state, right? Communism is a variant of socialism. And in Cuba, again, you do what you do for the greater good right? That idea of the greater good being important here. You do it for the greater good of the nation. So in the case of a collectivist society, group needs are paramount. And a great example of collectivism in practice would be, let's say, in the days of COVID, a student comes to school and, they have a temperature, they're coughing, they're sneezing, right? They have a sore throat, and that kid walks into the class. We look at that individual and we say to ourselves, whoa, you cannot be here. Now, why do we say that? Because that individual can infect the entire class and make them incredibly sick or possibly die, right? And in a collectivist society, we tell that person to go away, right? We tell that person to please, stay away until you're better and then come back, because we need to make sure the group, the collective, is secure. Now, basic understanding here, folks, from all this, collectivism is on the left and the group, the collective, is incredibly important. Now, let's switch to the right. So to the right of the spectrum, we have individualism. Okay, individualism, and it's the opposite of collectivism. If collectivism is the group is greater than the individual, then individualism is the individual, right? The singular unit is more important or is greater than, hence again the mathematical notation there. The individual is greater than the group. And in an individualist society, individual needs are paramount. We can't do things like shun people just because of the needs or the wants of the group. So great example, guys, of individualist societies in the world, right? We talked about collectivism. We said like modern day Cuba, North Korea, former Soviet Union. A great example of an individualist society would be the United States of America. In the United States of America, guys, they are so individualist that they don't even believe that, individuals should be provided health care by the government, because it's not the government's job, government representing the collective, right? It's not the government's job to provide you with health care. It is your job. And if you can't feed yourself and provide shelter, clothing, food, all those things that humans need to survive, it is your fault. And guys, it kind of makes sense when you understand the history of the United States of America, right? I'm not American, right? I'm Canadian, but I understand quite a lot about American history. And guys, American history was born out of individualism. It was the first great experiment in modern times in individualism, right? And they basically reject government power because they feel that government power has the ability to become tyrannical and basically mess with or take away the rights of the individual. And that's not good, right? That's not good. So again, basic understanding here, folks, is individualism is a rightist ideology. So collectivism on the left, individualism on the right. Now, let's move down a little bit here. We're going to move down to the second spectrum here. Whew, this is hard, right? And guys, the second spectrum in red here says the desire for change, alleviating or keeping the status quo. Now, first of all, what would make people desire change? Why would people think that change is something that is necessary? Well, typically, guys, if you want change, it's because there's things lacking in your life, security, prosperity, or other possible things. And if you don't want change, it's typically because you have that security, you have that prosperity, you don't see the world as problematic. Now, this idea of alleviating or keeping the status quo, to alleviate something means to get rid of it, to keep it obviously means to maintain it, right? And the term status quo is a Latin term that basically translates to the way it is. So depending upon your perspective, your lens, when you look at the world, you look around at what's going on, if you see the world as fundamentally flawed, you're going to want to alleviate or change the status quo. And those people who want to alleviate or change the status quo are people that we typically find here on the left, right? It is the people on the left that see the world as flawed and wanting to change society. Now, The opposite of people who want to change the status quo are individuals who want to keep it or maintain it. And we typically find those people here in this right of center position. And then we have to talk about the reactionaries. They're kind of confusing, but we need to know where they reside on the spectrum. All right, so let's talk about the left side of the spectrum first. I'm just going to get a little drink of water here. 1 second. My apologies for my voice getting kind of muffled there. Okay, so the left side of the spectrum. Now, guys, I'm purposely keeping collectivism and this second spectrum on the screen because of the fact that I want you to understand that anything on the left in this spectrum falls under the umbrella of collectivism. Anything on the right side of this second spectrum here in red falls under the umbrella of individualism. Okay? Now, with that being understood, on the left side of the spectrum, in what we call the left of center position, we find the liberal. Now, guys, when we use liberal in this context, we're not talking specifically about the Liberal Party of Canada, right? If you're Canadian, although the Liberal Party of Canada would typically be found in that left of center position. In the United States, politically speaking, we have the Democrats, right? The Democrats are that party who they look around at society, right, as do liberals here in Canada, and they see flaws. They see problems in society, and they believe it is their job to alleviate those flaws. What kind of flaws are we talking about? What makes them think that society is flawed? Well, they see things like poverty. They see things like racism. They see things like homophobia, sexism. They see things like climate change. They see all sorts of issues that exist in society. And as a result, they think that we should progress towards something better. And we see that in the definition that we have for liberals. So liberals want change. Liberals, people who identify as a liberal, see society as fundamentally flawed. Problems, right? Sexism, racism, poverty, whatever it happens to be. And they believe that society needs to shift itself towards fixing those problems and that tomorrow can be better than today, right? We need to work and progress towards something better. And that something better, typically when we think about a better world or a perfect world, we think of the term utopia. The ultimate goal of the left is to create a perfect society where all needs and wants of individuals are basically taken care of, okay? So liberals want change. Now, the thing that's important to differentiate between the far left, the radical or revolutionary, and the liberal is the means in which we create this change. Liberals see society as flawed. They want change, but they will not use violence to achieve it, right? They will not use violence to achieve it. Just give me a sec here. So in my classroom, I have this handy dandy, it looks like a baseball bat, but it's actually a chair leg or a table leg, but it's nice and thick, right? It has some weight to it and stuff like that, and it's always fun to wave this around while in class. And guys, liberals won't use something like this. They won't play whack-a-mole with people in order to create the change they want. Well, if that's the case, Mr. Crosby, then how do liberals change the world? And it's through progressive policy, through laws, through legislation that or through protesting, right? If you're a liberal individual rather than a liberal government, then you're going to go out and protest. You're going to go out and you're going to try to persuade the government to do or create policies that are more progressive and look to change society. Okay, so that's the left of center liberal. So they're not happy with the way society is. They see it as fundamentally flawed and they want to see change, but they're not going to bash people's heads in order to create that change. All right, with that being said, let's move to the far left, right? You can see my cursor there. So in the far left position, we have the radical or revolutionary, okay? Guys, when we talk about the idea of being radical In social studies, typically we think of people who dramatically want to change society and typically will resort to violence in order to do it. So the radical or revolutionary, they look at the world as incredibly flawed. So as we move more to the left, the disenchantment with the status quo tends to increase, right? And if we go from sort of a left of center position to a far left position, those people really want change, right? They really want change. So they want immediate and drastic change. And they're so dissatisfied with the status quo that they're willing to burn everything down in order to create a better society. And ultimately, guys, what radicals or revolutionaries want to achieve is a utopian society where there's no homelessness, there's no poverty, there's no war, all those things that are looked at as blights on society would be eliminated, right? They would be gone. And we see radicals or revolutionaries because they believe that the ends justify the means so greatly that if we have to bash people's heads in order to create that change, if we need to kill people, then that is what we do. So radicals or revolutionaries are willing to resort to violence in order to create the change they want to see. So there's some important similarities and differences between the left of center liberal and the far left radical or revolutionary. Those people who are left of center, they see society as flawed. So they have that in common with the radical or revolutionary. Both of the positions on the left see society as flawed. They're both not happy with the status quo. However, the left of center, the liberal position, will not use violence, whereas the far left will. And I'll give you some examples of some radicals or revolutionaries that have existed in society. Those of you who took Social 20 last year here in Alberta should know the name Robespierre, right? Robespierre was the guy in charge of the radical phase of the French Revolution. He believed that if you weren't rah-rah revolution enough, then you were an enemy of the revolution. And what happened to those people during the Reign of Terror? Well, they met their fate with the national razor, right? The guillotine blade was dropped on their neck and their head was separated from the remainder of their body. And the streets of Paris ran red with blood, right? In those areas where the guillotines were chopping the heads off. So Robespierre is a great example of a person that would be seen as holding far left views of a radical or revolutionary. Another one, historically speaking, that you'll learn about here in Social 30 would be a guy like Vladimir Lenin, right? Lenin was the leader of the Russian Revolution. Lenin was the guy who ushered in the first communist state in the world, which would eventually become the USSR 5 years down the road, right? And that happened in 1917. Now, when you think about Lenin and communism in the Soviet Union, did they kill a whole bunch of people? And the answer is yes, they did. No one really knows how many people were killed in communist societies in the Soviet Union because they were killed in such large numbers that it was really irrelevant, right? Some people suggest that 20 million people were killed. Some people suggest 30. I've read in certain books that, they believe that 50 million people have been killed by or were killed by the Bolshevik party, right? The party of Lenin in the Soviet Union. So guys, the way that Lenin and the Bolsheviks justified this is that the people that we were killing were enemies of the revolution. They were capitalists, right? They were people who were trying to oppress the so-called proletariat. And these are some terms that you don't quite need to know yet, right? Oppress the workers. And if we have to kill 5 million people in order to save 30 million people, then that is what we do. Under the umbrella of collectivism, where the group is more important than the individual, right? The greater good must be pursued. If we sacrifice, this many people for a whole bunch of people, then that is justified. That is justified. Okay, now, with that being said, guys, that is the liberal and that is the radical or revolutionary. So key thing to remember here, folks, is number one, liberals want change, so do radicals, but liberals won't spill blood and radicals will. Okay, now let's move to the right of center position. Okay, and we're going to deal with the conservative first, and then we'll go over to the reactionary. Now, guys, the conservative, typically we dichotomize the conservative with the liberal, right? We typically have the liberal and conservative see each other as opposites. Now, if liberals are dissatisfied with the status quo, well, then conservatives, they are satisfied with the status quo. Conservatives want to conserve or keep things the way they are. If liberals see society as fundamentally flawed, then conservatives see society as not flawed. And typically, guys, the individuals who identify with conservatism are the ones who have what they need to be prosperous and secure in their personhood. So conservatives, as it says here, want to keep the status quo. They look around at society and they don't see anything wrong with it. And they believe that the present day should be based on the past or tradition. So the way things are right now should be a reflection of how things have always been. And conservatives typically see change as undesirable. They don't want change. Now, let's dichotomize a little bit the liberal on the left of center position from the conservative on the right of center position by looking at an issue that typically liberals and conservatives don't see eye to eye on. And, a great example of that would be something like, let's use legalization of marijuana, right? So typically people who are more liberal see marijuana as a benign drug. They believe that it's an individual's choice to partake in that. They're not harming anyone. So what's the big deal, right? Legalize marijuana, stop clogging up the courts with petty drug charges, tax it, regulate it, and make money off it, right? That's typically what liberals think about marijuana. And if you know anything about Canadian history, right, you will know that the Liberal Party of Canada is the political party that legalized marijuana here in Canada. It is the more liberal states in the United States that have, at the state level, legalized consumption of marijuana in those states as well. Now, alternatively, guys, when it comes to the legalization of marijuana, it is the conservative who says that, marijuana is a gateway drug and marijuana is harmful and it hasn't been legal in the past. Again, getting back to this idea of the past and tradition, marijuana has been legal in the past, so it shouldn't be legal today, right? It will lead to criminality. It will lead to further harder drug use, right? From marijuana, we then move up to cocaine to heroin, right? And then we get into crystal meth and like all these terrible drugs, right? So we keep it not legalized, right? We keep it illegal. So conservatives want to keep the status quo, and they believe that the current day should be based upon the way things have always been. And again, guys, like when you think about people who are liberal versus conservative, typically people who are liberal are the ones that, don't have the advantages that others have in society. So they want to see society change so that they can get those advantages as well. Now, the conservative, right, they're the ones who have those advantages. I mean, if you have wealth and power and prestige and security and all the things that people need to live a good life, why would you want to see society change, right? You wouldn't. It wouldn't make sense. Why would you want to give up that position of privilege and power? And typically people who have that privilege and power are the ones who identify as conservatives. It's the more disenfranchised, disenchanted individuals that identify as liberals. Now, with that being said, let's go to the far right. On the far right, we have reactionaries. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Crosby, if the liberal sees society as flawed and the radical and revolutionary really sees society as flawed, well, then people on the far right must really want to keep things the same. And the answer to that is no. And that's why students typically get reactionaryism confused, right? So on the far right, we have a group known as reactionaries, and the reactionary also sees society as flawed. They look around and they are not happy with the status quo either. So really, the only one that wants to maintain things are the conservative. The reactionaries actually want to go back in time, right? They want to go back to the good old days, right? You know that song by Kesha, right? The good old days. They want to go back to the good old days, back to when society was better, back to when times were more simple, back to times when society was more organized and happy, right? And I'll give you an example of the first reactionary society. The first reactionary society that we see in modern times, you could argue, was 1920s Italy under Benito Mussolini, right? 1920s Italy had just emerged from World War I. Italy was a broken nation, right? Even though at the end of the war, they were on the victor's side, right? They're on the winning side. They got very little from the Versailles Treaty, and the economy in Italy had slowed down. And Italy, based on its history, was a very proud nation, right? Italy, of course, was part of the Roman Empire, right? The city of Rome being sort of the headquarter of that. And of course, guys, knowing that proud history where Rome basically ruled much of Western Europe with the exception of Scotland, really, or would become Scotland, we see the Roman Empire as this thing that Italians were proud of. And 1920s Italy, after the war, was like a shadow of its former greatness of the Roman Empire. And this guy named Mussolini promised to bring that glory and that prestige back to the nation of Italy. So many of you probably don't know Benito Mussolini, maybe you do, but you definitely know the second reactionary society in sort of the last 150 years, and that would be 1930s Germany, right? 1930s Germany, of course, Germany was saddled with guilt for World War I. Germany was the only major central power left after World War I, and they were saddled with the guilt. The Versailles Treaty very much punished the nation of Germany, and as a result, Germany had to pay back reparations. They couldn't have an army of more than 100,000 men, no submarines, a limited number of warships, right? No airplanes for their air force, right? And all sorts of things like that. And as a result, Germany was basically like a neutered dog in the 1920s and early 1930s. And Germans were unhappy with that because of the reparations. Their economy had slowed down massively. The Weimar Republic stupidly printed more money in order to pay back those reparations. That caused hyperinflation, which also led to unemployment. When you combine hyperinflation and unemployment in Germany, things aren't good. So basic understanding here, guys, is things aren't good in Germany in the 1930s. And as a result, you get this individual from Austria who is Germanic named Adolf Hitler, who promises to restore order and glory back to Germany. And he wants to go back to a better day. What better day? Well, in Social 20, you would have learned about, if you're a student in Alberta, about Otto von Bismarck, hopefully, and the unification of Germany. When Germany was a strong, unified, militaristic, industrially powerful nation. So typically reactionary societies, guys, emerge out of nations where the current situation is desperate. And you have charismatic strongmen who promise to restore that order and glory that used to be, right? Whether it's Italy or Germany, that was the promise of Mussolini and also Adolf Hitler. So they want to go back in time, and their type of change, instead of being progressive, like on the left, progressing towards something better in the future, they want to go back to a better day. And they want to go back so strongly that they're willing to resort to violence to achieve those goals. Okay. So when we think about the far left and the far right, when we dichotomize radicals or revolutionaries with reactionaries, the difference between them is the type of change they want, right? We're talking about on the far left, we're talking about progressive change towards a glorious future. On the far right, we're talking about regressive change, back to that glorious past. But the similarity between them, what unites the far left and the far right, is the idea of use of violence to achieve those goals. We already talked about how communism, right, in the Soviet Union, it was responsible for 30 to 50 million deaths. Well, did fascism kill a whole bunch of people? Well, yeah, right? If you know anything about fascism, you know that fascism employs violence in order to achieve its goals. And did Hitler kill a whole bunch of people? Yep, he did, right? Hitler definitely killed a whole bunch of people. All right, and then last but not least, guys, on the second spectrum, I apologize this video. I was hoping for it to be under 30 minutes, but there's things we need to talk about here. We have the moderate, right? And for the most part, look, on the diploma exam, you're not going to get a lot of questions about moderates on it because they're really hard to pin down. Moderates are fence sitters. Moderates are like yes, but maybe no. You know what I mean? So moderates, they maybe believe that change is okay, but maybe not, right? And if we change things, we really need to think it out. We really need to plan it and make sure that where we go with that change doesn't become worse than what it is right now. And typically moderates, they're kind of like meh. You know what I mean? Like, I'll give you an example. Right, moderates are those fence sitters who, you know, your friends, there's you and two other friends. Sorry about that, guys. That's just an announcement in my school here. So anyways, moderates, you got three friends, you're going out for dinner, it's Friday night. One friend wants McDonald's, the other friend wants Wendy's, right? So there's like a tie, or there's no consensus there. So that third friend is asked, okay, where do you want to go, right? Do you want to go to McDonald's? Do you want to go Wendy's? And that third friend is like, meh, whatever, right? That's the moderate. So, moderates are pretty even keeled. They kind of just go with the flow, and they really don't have a lot of skin in the game, right? They want to keep things the way they are. They don't really want to see change. Like, they're really hard to pin down, which is why you're not going to see a lot of questions about moderates here in Social 30, just because, I mean, they're difficult, right? They don't really have sort of a defined agenda. All right. With that being said, guys, hopefully this video was helpful for you. If not, I apologize. I just wasted, 30 odd minutes of your life. But hopefully, yeah, guys. So go through this again if you need it, and we'll see you later. Okay. Peace, guys.